Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning in partnership with Harvard Online and the Harvard Alumni Association. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Stephanie Sniancheva. Without further ado, Stephanie, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Really delighted to be here with you this evening. Thank you all for joining. So this is today about zero-sum thinking and the roots of US political divides, which is a recent project we have done with some co-authors. The idea of this talk is this notion of zero-sum thinking. And let me define what this is. So zero-sum thinking is this idea that if one group or some individuals gain, it must come at the expense of others. So it's the idea that there's a limited amount of good. If you get a larger slice of the pie, it means that I must be getting a smaller slice of the pie. And this is a concept that was originally proposed by an anthropologist, George Foster, to explain the worldview, the mindset of small-scale pre-industrial societies. And in these societies, resources were truly scarce, and there was very little economic growth. So perhaps the world was correctly perceived as zero-sum. But we are trying to understand whether this type of mindset has a relevance for today in a rich country like the United States, and we'll see evidence from other countries too. And we're really trying to answer two big questions here. One is, what does zero-sum thinking explain differences in views about policy today? So does it explain the views that we have for government redistribution, immigration, affirmative action, gender equality, trade policy, you name it. So we'll talk about all of those. And then second, what are the determinants of zero-sum thinking? Why do different people have different degrees of zero-sum thinking? And for this, we want to go back to their own past and to US history. So we collect data, very detailed data on people's own experiences and that of their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents. And with this data on ancestry and family background in hand, we can look at some key aspects of US history, such as economic mobility, this idea of the American dream, immigration, enslavement, and see how that has shaped zero-sum thinking. One thing that I do want to briefly go back to here is I had the slides with some basically media screenshots, and this is by no means exhaustive. If you look at many media titles today, you will probably see a lot of zero-sum style titles. So these are here, for instance, on the right, ideas like record profits are unpaid wages, this idea that profits come at the expense of workers. Every billionaire is a policy failure, the idea that the gains of the rich come at the expense of the poor, as opposed to more positive sum rhetoric, here on the left. And if you look at titles today, you'll see many of these zero-sum ideas. If the US and China trade, the gains of one of the countries must be at the expense of the other. If there are more international students, the slots must be taken away from US students, and so on. So you see a lot of these titles around. So I think it's a very relevant topic to look at today. And so let me tell you right away how we do this. So what we do is something typical for the social economics lab, which I run at Harvard, which is to leverage large-scale online surveys. So these are ways in which we can get into people's minds to really understand how people think, how they understand economic issues, economic policies. And this is also what we do in this project. We have a large-scale survey that has been running for essentially 4 years, so between October 2020 and July 2023, where we collected in 7 waves data from more than 20,000 respondents. This is done through commercial survey companies who typically run surveys for businesses and market research purposes. And what's really great is that they have very broad pools of respondents and also different ways of rewarding people for their time so that they can attract different sets of people. So it's not just cash rewards, but frequent flyer miles, hotel points, in partnership with airlines, retail stores or hotels, so that you can really attract a large set of people. And so, like with many surveys, you never really get the really poor people or the really rich people, but you have very good broad representativeness of a sort of middle range of the US population. And so this data, you can view it as broadly representative of an average US respondent here. And I show you on the slides the various blocks of the survey. What do we ask people about? So the first block is quite standard. We ask people about their background, so their political views, their gender, their age, their household income, education, etc. The second block is more interesting here. This block called ancestry. So here we ask people quite detailed information about their ancestors going back 3 generations. So it covers things such as the place of residence, where people grew up and lived, both themselves, their parents, their grandparents, the age or year of birth, their occupation, how they feel like they ranked economically relative to others at that time. So of course, not everybody knows everything about all the way to all the grandparents. But there's quite a bit of information here. And note that if you ask about 3 generations, namely here all the way to the grandparents' generation, there is also implicitly some information about the great-grandparent. Because, for instance, if you know where the grandfather grew up, then it tells you something about where the great-grandparents lived in sort of their adulthood. And so this information is really valuable. It's very hard to have such family history in other data, and we'll use it a lot in this paper to be able to really, in great depth, say what types of experiences shape, your ancestors' views and even trickle down to your own views today. After that comes this policy views block. So this is where we ask people about a whole range of policy views. Things related to redistribution, things related to immigration, trade, etc. So a lot of different policy views. And then finally, of course, we have a block that measures the zero-sum mindset. Let me talk about this in a bit more detail so that you actually understand what exactly we mean by it and how we ask about it. So this is here how we ask about zero-sum mindset. And as I go through these questions, you may want to ask yourself, how you might answer, how you would think about this. So we're interested in a general tendency to think in zero-sum terms. So we're not really interested in the belief that one specific setting is zero-sum, which, could be very influenced by your political views or other demographics. So this is why we ask people about the extent to which they think different interactions in different settings are zero-sum. So for instance, between different ethnic groups. In the United States, if one ethnic group becomes richer, this generally comes at the expense of other groups in the country. How would you answer this between strongly disagree to strongly agree? Or between immigrants and non-immigrants? If immigrants gain, is this at the expense of non-immigrants? Do you agree or disagree with this generally? Between countries, if one country trades, are the gains at the expense of the other country? Or can both countries gain? Between income groups, if some people get richer, is this necessarily at the expense of others? So with all these measures here, we can get a sense across many different domains how people think about these situations. Do they perceive them as competitive and zero-sum or not? And let me just show you a bit of a histogram of the answers here. And actually, I'm showing you this in 2 ways. So at the top here, you can see for each of these domains, so between ethnic groups, between immigrants and non-immigrants, we trade between countries or between people of different incomes, just the average distribution of answers. So there's quite a bit of variation. People have different views on these. You see that the bars are everywhere, relatively high. So it's not that everybody agrees on the extent to which these domains are zero-sum. You can see that for trade, and this was done, before, as you saw, before 2025, trade, many people were sort of neither agree nor disagree. So there was more uncertainty about trade. And there's a variation across these domains. And then at the bottom of this slide, it's also very interesting. I split this by the political leaning of the respondent. So plotting these histograms of answers, but separately for Democrat and Republican respondents. And you see that there's, of course, some variation, across across these domains and political differences. So, for instance, if you take the immigration question called citizenship here, you see that Republican respondents are more likely to agree with this zero-sum statement than Democrat respondents. On the other hand, if you pick the income, so to what extent do you agree the gains of rich people come at the expense of poor people? Here, Democrat respondents are much more likely to agree with this than Republican respondents. So this is exactly what we're trying to not capture. We're not trying to capture, just the political belief that you have here, but instead we're interested in your general tendency to think in zero-sum terms. So this is why we're going to convert this into a general measure. So although the answers are, positively correlated, we're going to basically average them, or more technically, we're going to extract the first principal component, which means your average tendency, despite the fact that you might answer different things to these questions, your average tendency to answer in more zero-sum terms. So this is what we're going to call the zero-sum measure here. And this is, when I say it's correlated with policy views, this is what I'll mean. So don't think about it as one specific domain, but rather to all these questions do you generally tend to, answer in zero-sum terms. And so let me show you some interesting features about who is more zero-sum, where zero-sum tends to happen more. So first, if you look geographically, so this semi-map here tries to represent different US states. And, in red, you see places that are more zero-sum. In green, you see places that are less zero-sum. So I don't know what your priors were, but the least zero-sum states in the US are Utah and then Hawaii. And the most zero-sum state is actually New York. So this is just what the data shows on average here. But you can also see that this map doesn't necessarily look like other maps we might be used to. It doesn't at first glance look like a political map. Red states, blue states, that's not what you see here. So zero-sum seems to be, have a different geographical distribution than other things that we're used to. Some other interesting facts here. So how does it correlate with some key economic characteristics? So in the top left panel here, you see the average zero-sum index for people in rural areas, people in suburban areas, and people in urban areas. And you can see that people in urban areas are significantly more likely to be thinking in zero-sum terms than people in rural areas. And this might, be surprising or not to you. And what drives this? So we don't have the perfect answer, but you can think of this as either what we call a selection effect, which means people who are more zero-sum, who have some other characteristics, tend to be in urban areas. So they're already like that. It's not the city that makes them this way. Or it could be what we call a treatment effect, which is the city makes you be more zero-sum. So it could be a bit of both. Imagine that in the city, there's more competition for housing, there's more competition for jobs, which may make you feel like the world is more zero-sum. So it could be that the city experience makes you think in more zero-sum terms, or it could be that more competitive people go to these urban areas and try to compete for the jobs and the housing, etc. So we don't know. It could be a bit of both. It could be just one or the other. You can look at the top right panel as well, which shows you zero-sum thinking by education here. And there's another interesting pattern here. So if you look at this graph, you see initially that as you get more education, starting from low education, it's correlated with being less zero-sum. However, once you get into the postgraduate degrees, so PhD, JDs, MDs, at that point, you're significantly more likely to be zero-sum again. Again, as we spoke for the urban-rural divide, it could be a selection effect. It could be that people who tend to be thinking in zero-sum terms, perhaps more competitive, tend to go into these degrees. Or it could be that the nature of these degrees, perhaps with a lot of competition, make you more zero-sum. So we don't know, but it is an interesting fact here. And then at the bottom, you see the pattern by income. Again, it's not quite monotone. So initially, as you have more income, you become less likely to be zero-sum. But after a while, it ticks up again a little bit, and so it's not it's not linearly declining in your income. Something that is very striking and really important in this paper, and will perhaps be a bit surprising, is the fact that zero-sum thinking is not mainly a partisan issue at all. So unlike so many other things today, it is not something that is associated with the left or the right. It is not something that is more widespread among Republican respondents or Democrat respondents. Instead, it seems to be quite a bipartisan issue. So if I plot here, which you could have already seen from the histograms I showed you earlier, if I plot the distribution of this average tendency of this zero-sum index by Democrat and Republican respondents, you can see that it's quite overlapping. So it might be slightly shifted to the left, to the right for Democrat respondents, but not by much. And so the average measure barely differs between Democrats and Republicans. So it is not something that is very partisan. Instead, it's quite evenly distributed on both sides of the political spectrum. So very importantly, this was one of our starting questions. What does this do to our policy views? And this slide might be a little bit technical, but what we're trying to say here is that a zero-sum mindset ultimately involves the belief that the success of some group comes at the expense of others. And so you would therefore expect that a more zero-sum minded respondent would support policies that correct for the harm that one group imposes on another and help the disadvantaged group. So because you might consider this to be fair, people care about the fairness of the process through which income and wealth are achieved, and especially if it comes at the expense of others. And so if you believe one group is essentially becoming rich because of another, you want something to be done about this. So for instance, if you believe that the gains of the rich come at the expense of the poor, you would support more redistribution. You would like to, help the poor people at the expense of richer people. So you would support more progressive taxation, more social insurance, a more generous social safety net. If you believe that women are doing poorly in the labor market because men are doing well, then you will support more affirmative action for gender equality. If you believe that a racial group is doing poorly because another racial group is doing well, you will support more affirmative action by race, and so on. And this is where it becomes so interesting that it is not a partisan issue and that it's somewhat counterintuitive. If you believe that the gains of immigrants come at the expense of non-immigrants, you will also be someone who's anti-immigration. So it will pick, ideas on both sides of the political spectrum, and create this interesting policy mix with this leading thread that you are trying to basically, help the group that's being disadvantaged because you believe that it's losing at the expense of another. And this is exactly what we see if we look at the correlation of policy views with the zero-sum thinking. So this slide might be a little bit, heavy to read here, but essentially what it's showing is in each row, it has different policy views listed that are grouped by category. So redistribution-related policies summarized by redistribution index. Index of racial attitudes. Are you generally, pro aware of racism and discrimination, pro affirmative action to help with racial inequalities? Gender attitudes index. Similarly, are you pro gender equality? Anti-immigration index. Are you generally someone who has anti-immigration attitudes and supports more restrictions for immigration? And depending on the specification, you have these different symbols. There's a baseline specification that's adding extra controls to this. But the findings are always this, which is if you're someone who's more zero-sum, you're going to support more redistribution, more policies to reduce racial and gender discrimination, and more restrictive immigration policies. And this is true even conditional on political leaning. So it is something that very much, takes from non-traditional left and right divides here. And if you think about it, it is somewhat reflective of policy developments that we do see, here in the world, that that we perhaps see more and more discussed. Another thing that I wanted to tell you, and we don't need to look at every single panel in this slide here, but something important to ask is whether zero-sum thinking is truly a different dimension from other core beliefs that people have studied, that philosophers, political scientists, even economists have put out there as very important for our policy views. So in each of these panels, essentially what we do here is to show that even if you include measures for these other core beliefs, zero-sum thinking remains very predictive of your policy views. So what are these different beliefs? Well, it's what's listed here in these rows with some shortcuts. So some important beliefs that people have studied are, the belief that luck is more important than effort. Basically, do you believe in merit or do you believe in just circumstances and luck? The role of perceived mobility. Do you feel like everybody has a chance of making it, that there's equality of opportunity? Are you more universalist versus more communitarian? Do you generally tend to, care about a broad group of people or simply about your community? To what extent is tradition important to you? Do you trust others in general? That's generalized trust. Do you trust the government? How important is religion to you? So these have been shown, by other people and other important studies to be really important determinants of your policy views. And yet, in a nutshell, if you include measures for these, zero-sum thinking is still there and important in addition. So it is not something that is absorbed by these other beliefs. It is truly a distinct dimension. And I like to give one example to really drive this point home. If you think about views on redistribution, how much progressivity do you support? How much redistribution do you support? Yes, it's super important the extent to which you think, income is achieved by luck versus effort. If you're someone who thinks, people work hard for their money, you're generally going to be less inclined to redistribute income. But that's not the only thing that matters. People don't just care whether Jeff Bezos worked hard to get his wealth. Many people might say yes, others might say no. They also care, did this come at the expense of others? Did Jeff Bezos' wealth come at the expense of retailers and bookstores and workers? Or was it a positive sum activity? Did it contribute to others? And so people care about this too when they think about, should we tax Jeff Bezos? And is it fair that Jeff Bezos gets to keep so much wealth? So I think this is just a small example to show you that, yes, zero-sum thinking is a separate, distinct dimension. This is mainly, for the US, but you can look at other countries, thanks to the World Value Survey, which does have an imperfect question, but nevertheless a question that sort of captures zero-sum thinking. So it's not perfect because it only asks about the income domain. So the question is, to what extent people agree with one statement more than the other. The first statement is people can only get rich at the expense of others. The second statement is wealth can grow, so there's enough for everyone. So it is a relatively general question, but it still makes you feel mostly about, between rich and poor people, not so much between immigrants or other groups. So it's less general than what we have. But the World Value Survey, has data here for 72 countries. So it's nice to see whether at least the broad findings, remain there. And the answer is yes. So the same policy correlations that I showed you for the US remain true in these other 72 countries. So the fact that when you're more zero-sum, you're going to support more redistribution, more anti-immigration, more gender and race equality policies. So it's nice to see that this is not something that is specific to the US, but actually something that seems to be much more general. So I wanted to show you the patterns of zero-sum by age or by cohort. So this is what is here on this slide. So in blue, you can see the zero-sum index plotted for each cohort of birth in our sample. So going all the way back to people born in the 1940s to people born in the 2000s, you can see their average tendency to think in zero-sum terms. And you see that it's been increasing. So except a small dip in the 1990s, it seems to generally be the case that the younger generations are significantly more likely to think in zero-sum terms than the older generations. So what is this due to? Well, the way we think about this thing is, in models of cultural evolution, younger generations tend to have beliefs that are more matched to the current environment. So people are adapted to what they're seeing, especially what they're growing up with. And then once these views are formed, you tend to keep them later in life. So, people who are older today, they might remember how things were when they were younger. It's not necessarily beliefs that are adapted to the current world. So that's what models of cultural evolution say. And indeed, if you look at the data, is it the case that the US was less zero sum in the past? Well, just looking at mobility or economic growth, it seems that the answer is yes. Both mobility, intergenerational mobility, the chances of making it have declined for the recent generations, and so has economic growth, especially if you think about widespread growth. So growth that, for instance, also lifts the bottom 50% of the population. And this was the other line on this chart here, the black line, which is on the right vertical axis, which shows you the growth in incomes for the sort of bottom median of the population. Is everybody able to participate in economic growth? And the answer is, well, less so today than for the older generations. So people, today are growing up in these very formative, impressionable years. They're growing up with lower growth, lower economic mobility, in contrast to the older generations where things were different. Just from the US, by the way, you can't say whether this is an age effect or a cohort effect, a generational effect. So put differently, just looking at this graph, you can't say whether younger people today might become more, less zero sum in the future, whether it's just age. But using the data from the World Value Survey for all the different countries, that's when you can start to disentangle what's an age effect and what's a generational effect. And this is very much a generational effect. So you see this pattern that links zero sum and growth, very similar in other rich countries. So it looks very similar to the US. And the pattern is basically flipped. It's reversed for lower income or middle income countries, where growth today and income mobility today seem to be higher than in the past. So in those countries, the younger generations are significantly less zero sum than the older ones. So the economic environment here seems to really matter and play a big role in shaping those views. I wanted to briefly go back to this idea that zero-sum thinking is not mainly a partisan issue. And instead, it's something that can explain a lot of within-party divisions or within-party variation. So, of course, a lot of views about the government and policy tend to be quite aligned with political affiliation. Yet there is quite a bit of individual variation within party. Of course, not everybody within the same party agrees. So, for instance, there are many Republicans who support more government redistribution. There are Democrats who support more, strict anti-immigration laws, etc. And it looks like zero-sum thinking is something that can help us explain this within party variation, since it is not something that explains across party variation. So, for instance, look at this graph here, which shows you how supportive respondents are of redistribution, so a pro-redistribution index. And we plot it among moderate Republicans on the left and strong Republicans on the right by zero-sum quartiles. So 1 means you're in the less zero-sum thinking people, and 4 means you're in the most zero-sum thinking people. And you see that even within the Republican Party, people who are more zero-sum will support more redistribution, driven by this idea that, the gains of rich people are more likely to come at the expense of poor people. Similarly, if you look at support for universal health care, which is what this figure shows, that's one way of redistributing, of helping lower income families. And again, the support is much stronger among Republicans who hold more zero-sum views. On the flip side, we have or I think I don't have it here on the slides, but if you look at among Democrat respondents, those who are more zero-sum are significantly more likely to support stricter immigration policies and more immigration restrictions. So going back to these patterns, by age, etc., which highlight the role of the economic environment, this brings us to the second big part of the paper, which is, well, what shapes this zero-sum mindset? What in your history or the family history can explain why some people are more likely to think in zero-sum terms than others? And we look at some key features of US history, some really important parts of what has happened in the US, namely economic mobility, this idea of the American dream, immigration, another very important part, and then race and enslavement. So how did these phenomena shape zero-sum thinking? So if we start from economic mobility, if there is no growth, if there is economic stagnation, then one can only gain at the expense of others. If someone's doing better, but the pie is not growing, it must come at the expense of other people. With economic growth, everybody in principle could be made better off, and everybody might have a chance to rise up. So in our data, remember that we ask people about the relative economic standing of themselves and their ancestors among other families at that time. So for instance, right now, compared with other families in America, would you say that your household income is, far below average, all the way to far above average? Similarly, for your parents, when you were growing up, how do you think they were ranking? Your grandparents, etc. And then we can measure upward mobility basically as the change between generations. So a positive score means that you feel like this next generation is doing better than the previous one. A negative score means that you think it's doing less well. And if we plot zero-sum thinking against this, it's what we see here on this slide. So on the left, let's start with the left panel here. The horizontal axis plots basically this perceived mobility between the parent and the respondent. So how well the father did when adult versus how well the respondent's doing today. A +2 means you feel like you're doing much better. A -2, you feel like you're doing much worse. And then the vertical axis shows you the zero-sum index of the respondent. So how zero-sum are you today? And you can see that having experienced more mobility relative to your father is correlated with less zero-sum thinking. The middle panel shows you the same, but relative to your grandparents. So if you feel like relative to your grandparents, you're doing better, again, you're less zero-sum. And then all the way to the right, relative to your great-grandparents, which is basically when your grandparents were growing up, again, you're less likely to think in zero-sum terms if you feel like you've had mobility relative to them. So in a nutshell, feeling that your family has experienced upward mobility is significantly correlated with less zero-sum thinking. So it seems to be true at the micro level too. And remember, we saw it at the macro level too. Growing up in times of lower growth and lower mobility makes you more likely to be zero-sum and vice versa. Let me move to the second big topic, which is immigration and zero-sum thinking. So for immigration, usually immigrants in the US had an improved quality of life, and especially for their children. And generally this did not come at the expense of others. So there's some really great research done, especially for this age of mass migration, essentially 1860 to 1920, where a lot of immigrants came to the US in search of a better life. And the research shows that they actually really benefited the communities around them. So areas that received more of these immigrants, all the way to the county level, did much better economically over the long run. So it seems like not only did immigrants themselves experience mobility and economic welfare, they also contributed to others. And what we see in our data is two things. First, if you just look at whether a respondent is an immigrant, first, second, third generation, already that is quite correlated with your zero-sum thinking. So here I just plot the average zero-sum index. If you're a first-generation immigrant, if you're a second-generation or third-generation immigrant, and then other means, usually it means no immigrant ancestry. We didn't ask for more than fourth generation, but very few people here would answer that. And so what you can see is that in general, being an immigrant, you're less likely to be zero-sum, and then it sort of increases as it gets further in time, second, third, other further generations or no generations. So that own experience is already correlated with less zero-sum thinking. But even more than that, there's also an indirect exposure. So if you look at places that had higher shares of immigrants, in that age of mass migration, and you today live in those places, or your parents live there, or your grandparents live there, that is related to you being less zero-sum today. So as your family members back in time saw these immigrants doing well, their beliefs changed, and something is transmitted in the family history down the generations to make you today also be less zero-sum. So a very interesting thing about things being transmitted in the generation. And then the final, big factor that I wanted to tell you about is in race and enslavement, as they're very linked. So slavery is in general an extreme zero-sum form of production, and it's related to coercion, oppression, violence. So a very zero-sum regime. And it didn't end, in the US after abolition. Many forms of coercion, oppression, and racism persisted in places that had slavery. And it seems that this is something that really, really shaped views in the US. So let's look at it in several ways here. So first, because of its close ties with race, we can start by looking at differences in zero-sum thinking across racial groups in the US. So this is what the figure shows here, sort of just plotting the raw data. So the least zero-sum group is actually Asian or Asian Americans. And then the most zero-sum group is Black or African American respondents. White is sort of in the middle. Hispanic, Latino respondents are a little bit more zero-sum. So you already see this pattern by race. And this is also, true if you do a proper regression analysis, controlling for other things like income, etc. Another interesting thing is to see, and we asked this question of the respondents, digging into their family history of enslavement. So we asked respondents if any of their ancestors has been enslaved, and if they had, to describe who had been enslaved and in what form. So we use open-ended questions here so that respondents can freely express, what they consider to be forms of enslavement. And what we see is that the survey question capture, enslavement in the US South, but also the Holocaust, imprisonment and internment during war, indentured servitude, forced reservation of indigenous people. So people mention, many different forms of enslavement that they know their ancestors were subject to. And so we can look here, breaking it into different racial groups and looking at whether someone said that they had enslaved ancestors. So those are the blue triangles, or no, those are the red dots. And if we look at the results here, for instance, for Black respondents, do those who had enslaved ancestors, think in more zero-sum terms today? Yes, but only a little. So it is not just the direct experience of enslavement here that matters for African Americans, or it's been a very generalized experience for that group. For other groups, yes. So if you're a white respondent whose ancestors were enslaved, you're much, much more likely to be zero-sum than white respondents whose ancestors were not enslaved. So, enslaved ancestry is associated with more zero-sum thinking, but Black respondents are more zero-sum, even controlling for this, and the effects are smallest for them. And so why is that the case? Well, there's many explanations for this, but one is that slavery led to very pervasive racism and institutional biases, such that essentially, most African American, Black Americans have been affected by this history of enslavement indirectly, not just those whose ancestors were directly enslaved. And we actually see further evidence for this that I will show you below. But first, I wanted to also show you that if you look at specific episodes of enslavement here, so were your ancestors enslaved, specifically African descendants, or the Holocaust, indentured servants, Japanese American internment, Native American enslavement, all these forms of enslavement are significantly correlated with more zero-sum thinking. And here's some evidence for why we think this has really persisted and is quite important. This figure basically shows you the lasting effects of slavery. So what are we showing here? Well, you can measure the extent to which counties in which respondents, parents, or grandparents grew up had slavery in 1860. So captured by the share of enslaved people in 1860. So this is what the figure shows here. So take the first panel to the left. The x-axis shows you the share of enslaved people in 1860 in the respondent's childhood county, so where the respondent grew up, so many years later after abolition. And then we plot against this the zero-sum thinking of the respondent. So you see that it's very positive and quite strong. And in the middle panel, if you look at the county where the parents grew up, well, the respondent still is going to be more zero-sum if their parents grew up in these counties, even though they might no longer live there. And then to the right, you see that same for the grandparents' counties. If the grandparents grew up in counties that had a higher share of enslaved people in 1860, the respondent today is more zero-sum. So what does this say? Well, this is saying that the effects of living in areas with high historical enslavement are still pronounced for the current generation. So there's something about these places, about the mindset in that places that has persisted many, many decades later. So it is not something that is done. It is something that's still shaping people who live there in their mindset. And indeed, I want to show you something even stronger, which is that this mindset didn't just remain confined to the US South. So something incredibly interesting done in recent work by Bazzi and co-authors shows that the values and beliefs of people who migrated out of the South, especially white Southerners who migrated out of the South states, were spread outside of the South in a large wave of white migration. And so what we do here is we look at whether this type of out-migration shaped zero-sum thinking. So it's basically called the other great migration, in addition to the great migration of Black individuals who also moved out from the South to other parts of the US. And what you can see is that if you plot basically the share of Southern white people in the childhood county, your own, your parents, your grandparents, it's all, again, related to you being more zero-sum. So it's not only if you were in those southern states that had high enslavement. If you were in other states and other counties that had these influx of white Southerners, which essentially exported a Confederate culture, the culture from those states with high shares of enslavement, again, it shapes the zero-sum thinking in those places. So this is something really fascinating because it shows that not only does a historical episode really persist in those places where it happened, but it can even get exported with a migration and then shape mindsets in the new places where people go. So this is a bit what I wanted to show you here with those additional historical facts. So in conclusion, there's this fundamental question or mindset that we're all grappling with, which is, do the gains of some come at the expense of others, and how zero-sum is the world? And in this project, we show that this has some important implications for US policy and politics. I think it has the potential to help us better understand a bit of a more complex set of political and policy relationships that's not just as simple as Democrat and Republican or left and right. And then it's something that is very much rooted in people's lived experience, in people's reality. it is clearly not something that should be dismissed as a bias. It's very deeply linked to people's lived reality. We looked at economic mobility, we looked at immigration, we looked at enslavement. So it is something that is very rooted in those experiences. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm very eager to hear your questions and comments in the Q&A.
Thank you, Stephanie. The first question here is: do you believe zero sum thinking is an innate cognitive bias, or is it more of a learned behavior in response to political and social conditions?
Great question, which really just echoes what I think I said in the conclusion, which I think our results indicate that it's something that's very much caused by the lived experience. So it is by no means, a misperception or a bias. People who are more zero sum have lived through situations that are truly more zero sum. The experience of enslavement is a very stark example of this, or who have witnessed this system around them. So I think it is very rooted in a reality, and this is why when sometimes people ask, "Oh, how can we change this mindset?" The answer is to me, the right question is not how can we change this mindset, but rather how can the experiences and the policies and the world be more positive sum, which is hopefully what we economists are trying to work on every day, find the more positive sum policies.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is: can you comment on whether you are viewing zero sum thinking as an error in judgment?
So I think it's very, very related to the previous question. So I think I already answered that by saying no. I think it is something that reflects people's reality and experience.
This question says: what were your expectations and beliefs before you began your work to develop your current assessment?
I usually try to go into this, as agnostically as possible. So we are scientists, so we do form some hypotheses, but we're trying to not let our priors, or our judgment cloud what we will actually see in the data. So we went into it with, these hypotheses that if you believe the world is more zero sum, you will want to, help the disadvantaged groups. You would like to correct um, for this unfairness, and that turned out to be true. What we were not expecting necessarily, or we didn't know going in, is how partisan this would be, and it turns out is actually very evenly spread across the political spectrum. We did not know about this age pattern that we would find that is very strong, that young people are, in many rich countries, including the US, much more zero sum than the older generation, again, because of their economic experience. So all these, I think, are very interesting findings that we did not have in mind before starting.
An anonymous attendee asked: how do we remind our representatives that their job is to find solutions by advocating for their constituents, but not freezing in place because of this zero sum value system? While I agree with a zero sum is better than a bad agreement, how do we change the narrative to zero sum agreement to move forward and to reconcile?
Great question. So, as we just said, I think ultimately the push has to be for policies that make the world less zero sum, because perceptions and mindsets follow reality, and follow people's lived experience, as we showed here. And of course, it's hard. It's not easy to find perfectly positive sum policies, but I want to give some examples that economists are studying and working on. One example of a positive sum policy is usually innovation policy. Innovation grows the pie. It's something that makes things possible that were not possible before, and it's something that has the potential to expand our economic pie. Um, Trade policy is another example. When two countries trade, normally there's gains from trade. That's what we call gains from trade. Both countries can be made better off. The economic pie can grow. But as I'm saying this, you're probably also thinking, oh, but there's something else, and you would be right. If the pie grows, that doesn't mean that the gains are equally shared. So an important part of policy is to make sure that the gains are also more equally shared. So yes, trade creates gains from trade, but there will be winners and losers. And something needs to be done to help the people who lose from it. So there will be gains, but they have to be redistributed as well in order to help those who are losing from the situation. Same for innovation. Some people's jobs might get displaced, even though there's overall a bigger economic pie. And it's again the job of policy to try to make those gains more equally spread, or otherwise people will consider it to be zero sum. Another example of a policy that is positive sum is investing in children, whether it's through nutrition, education, health. A lot of research shows that these policies essentially pay for themselves in the sense that, yes, they cost some money immediately, but they more than make up for this as the children grow up to be, more productive, higher income, healthier adults, not to even mention the whole well-being and happiness aspect. So policies like that target children can be, really positive sum as well. So those are just a few examples of, policies to think about as we read the news and continue to think about this.
Next question is, what do you see as persuasive argument premises, if any, for the abandonment of the zero sum outlook by those holding the view in America today?
Again, I think it's a very good question, but you probably already sensed the answer from everything I said, which is I think it's a mindset that is rooted in the reality people experience, and so it's not about changing the mindset, but it is about giving people a different, more positive sum experience. So all these policies that we discussed, are some ideas, but of course, I don't have the perfect solution.
Another question asks, what type of practices, especially in education, can combat zero sum thinking?
It's really another good question, and I think they're all very related. I can understand why people are asking these, but it's very much the same answer. I think ideally for young people who are in the education system, whether they're taking economics or other fields, to me the right question is, what can they come up with? What can they do and create that will make at least some people's life less zero sum? What can they do that will contribute to many people, that will grow the pie? So to me, that's the right question. And hopefully, in whatever field we are in, it's obvious to me in economics, but for other fields, it's there too: physics, biology, medicine. What can your field teach young people to grow the pie, to make as many people as well off as possible? I think that's the way to then change mindsets as well.
We have a question from Alvin. Is there any association between levels of zero sum thinking and levels of social capital in a community?
We didn't look at this incredibly rigorously, so please take this with a grain of salt. But the results we have here seem to indicate that yes. So in general, social capital, tends to make you work better in a community and give you the feeling that at least in that community, everybody could be made better off with cooperation. So I think yes, but it's definitely something to look at in more depth.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you again. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us for more signature events in the future. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal events. Thank you.